You're listening to Good Shepherd Catholic Radio, Eucharistic Revival Podcast. I always say we have a wonderful panel, but this really is a particularly wonderful panel. In addition to myself, Lucian Leone, we have our two regulars on this, Dr. Robert Moore-Jumonville. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Dr. Luciano.
Well, thank you, Roberto. And Kathy Blanchard. And Kathy is the Director of Family Discipleship at St. John the Evangelist Parish.
Yes, it's good to be here.
It's good to have you. And our special guest for this section is Dr. James Matthew Wilson. And Dr. Wilson, I'm not going to give him a long introduction because he's an author, he's a poet, he's a writer, he's a speaker, he comments on kind of Catholic culture. He's a teacher. He actually just did some sessions with both our fourth graders and our high school students, which I was so impressed with. It was how he was teaching them about poetry. So he just has an amazing resume, and we're just so excited to have him here and just sharing a little bit about, and he's going to be doing a talk here at Lumen Christi about liberal education, and we'll get into a little bit about that. But well, welcome, James, and it's good to have you. And I'd love to start if you could just give us kind of some background on your life and your testimony.
Sure, yeah. Well, it's great to be sitting here in Jackson, just an hour south of East Lansing, where I was born and raised. I went to St. Thomas Aquinas School, and that was my parish as I was growing up. We might crisscross a few episodes in my life as we're talking, but I'm just going to mention briefly my parish when I was a student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor was St. Thomas the Apostle. I now am a professor at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, although I work remotely. That's why I'm sitting here today in the snowy weather. And then my parish in Grand Rapids is St. Thomas the Apostle, so I am thoroughly informed by the angelic doctor in every aspect of my life and at every stage.
What's your confirmation name? Thomas?
Alas, just Matthew. So yeah, okay. I was a middle schooler, and very few middle schoolers are clever. So,
so if you could just kind of give us some your life, I'd especially like to talk about. I know a little bit of your story, your time like at U of M, and your conversion story, and maybe a little bit about growing up, but really focusing on kind of the Eucharist and kind of your life.
Sure. Yeah. So. One of the things we're talking about on this podcast, of course, is the Eucharist, and then one of the reasons I'm here in Jackson tonight is to talk about Catholic education. So I'll just combine those two in a couple anecdotes. I was always very grateful for my Catholic education at St. Thomas Aquinas. I loved the experience I had of, even though I couldn't have put these words on it as a first grader, but the integration of the intellectual life and my daily educational life with the life of prayer and the life of our worship within the church. That sense of the wholeness of things, when I lost it, as I did when I entered public school and middle school, I always felt it as a kind of wound, as a loss, as something had passed away. What that was, I couldn't have identified, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it since then. One of the great treasures of that education at St. Thomas, and aside from the integration of faith and reason, or the life of prayer and the life of learning, was something I want to highlight in particular, was fourth grade, which is the first year when I was growing up that one would study history. Now they study it in third grade, and so I'm seeing my third grade daughter, Cece, have some of the same experiences I got to have. What was special about fourth grade and learning history? Well, we learned Michigan history, but Mrs. Rambo, my teacher at St. Thomas, taught us Michigan history from a distinctly Catholic perspective. So what does that mean? Well, that American history didn't start at Plymouth Rock, and it didn't start with the Revolutionary War. It started with the French slipping down the rivers of the St. Lawrence Seaway and bringing the Catholic faith to the American Indians. And in fact, that set an entirely different vision for what America meant, what it meant to be an American for me and for my classmates than what I had, or what I might otherwise have have had. It gave us a sense of, on the one hand, of being very rooted in place and in the world, looking at the French place names in Michigan, the fact that we can go stand on the shore near Ludington and stand right where Father Marquette, for instance, passed away, is an incredible sense of the world and the place being rooted with meaningful people and events within the church's history. It also gave us a sense of course, the universal calling of the church. That when the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts, they came for religious reasons. They wanted to be left alone so that they could worship in their own fit fashion and to build a new society better than the one they had left. But when the French lay people and missionaries came, they came not to found a new society, but rather to enter into the society that they found there of the American Indians, and they wanted to draw the Native American culture and civilization within the broader Catholic world. And it's a beautiful vision of respect for others and a sense of true evangelization that the faith is in the faith we're called to share it with everyone. So learning that from the very beginning, I think that's the moment where I had a sense of the Catholic faith as shaping the whole of myself and the whole of the world. But I would have to say, that got lost a bit. And I went to public school for high school and college, and then also went to and then went to the University of Michigan for college. And there's two quick episodes from my life that I'll share with you. One of them, I hope everybody will find it comic and not merely sad. And that's just with some friends, I went to a Unitarian Universalist retreat in Ann Arbor for high school students. And it was Sunday morning. And why I did this, it was just to hang out with my friends. But it's Sunday morning, and we're sitting on the floor, Indian style, and somebody's holding up a stereo and playing that song Forever Young and nodding very gravely as if this were a very profound song, which it is not. And and I looked around, and I just thought, what is going on here? What is this that we're doing? Why are we sitting in this circle listening to this song as if it were a thing of profundity? And I was it was utterly unintelligible to me until suddenly something clicked in my mind. Oh, this is Mass. They don't have Mass. This is all they have. A boombox, Neil Young, and some graven nods. And I just thought, that was a profound moment, because I realized that the liturgy of the church was something that everyone has a deep yearning for. And if you don't get the real thing, you're going to find substitutes for it. And those substitutes will be superficial and false in comparison. So that was a great lesson to learn. It took me a while to really take to heart the full meaning of that lesson. And so Lucian was mentioning earlier an episode from a little bit later in my college years, and that was that I felt very estranged from the church. I thought it was something that I just didn't need. After all, college kids keep themselves pretty busy without getting up on Sunday morning, and so I just thought, well, maybe I don't believe in God anymore. So I went to Mass to test the hypothesis, and as I sat in St. Thomas, the Apostle Church in Ann Arbor, I wasn't sure what was stirring within me, but when communion time came, I came as I always did and went up to receive communion. And the moment that I received the host, I had such an inrushing consolation that I realized that I had come to that church expecting really to put the nail in the coffin of my faith, and I had rather received completely new life through the sacrament. And it was a marvelous moment in several respects, because I didn't know what it was. It was a true grace. It wasn't something that came from me. It wasn't something that belonged to me. It was rather something that had been given to me. And that was helpful, because I was a 21-year-old or 20-year-old college student, still had a lot of maturing to do, unfortunately, and my mind was certainly still very much in formation. And so, but having that experience of grace was, as it were, just a piece of empirical evidence that I couldn't claim to understand, but that I felt obliged to respect thereafter. So in the years ahead, I would say to people such as, well, I don't want to believe in God, but I have no choice because I've been given this grace that is now buried in my memory and something that can't go away. Now, why I ever didn't want to believe in God seems silly to me, but but nonetheless, that was my adolescent self, and I'm very grateful to have had that experience in
Do you
Ann
think
Arbor.
it was partly you mentioned middle school, just like and you moving out of sort of like one culture and then into like sort of more secular culture?
I've certainly noticed, in fact, I made this observation with, because my oldest for a time was in public school, and I saw that she replicated the same experience I had in early adolescence, and that is, when I first came to a public middle school from Catholic school, I was, wonderfully dogmatic. I'd like to recover that 11-year-old James Wilson, just decrying the immorality of everything, and really and just looking with horror at the sort of the lack of a sense of reverence and moral grounding that I would see in other 6th grade kids. By 7th grade, I'd pretty much settled into it, and I saw the same thing, unfortunately, with my daughter. I remember one of her little neighbor friends years ago said something without knowing it, that it was completely heretical and even sacrilegious, and Livia just said, "Oh no," and immediately explained the proper doctrine having to do with the resurrection. And I just thought, well done, we're doing okay as parents so far. But a year, 2 years later, I saw that she was being assailed by the same kind of feeling of a debased, but then in its own way oddly attractive culture. And I think that's just typical of pretty much all kids in our age. But it was interesting as a father to see almost the exact same formula that had affected my youth, shaping hers as well.
I used to ask students every semester that I used to teach G.K. Chesterton's Man Alive, and there's a character called Innocent Smith. So I would ask students, when did you lose your innocence? So this college kids, and inevitably about a quarter of the class would just middle school. I was like, when did you lose your innocence? Middle school, and maybe sometimes middle school bus, or something like that.
That sounds sadly familiar. Yes. Yeah.
Well, that is one of the nice things. I remember telling somebody that here in Jackson we have 3 elementary schools that go from K to 6, and Lumen Christi starts in 7th and goes 7th through 12. And it was one of my relatives, and I said, "Yeah, we start." And he said, "Oh, that doesn't sound good," because he was just concerned having middle school kids with high school kids. But I got to say, I think it really does work well here, because middle school is such a hard time for kids, and when they can look up to these in the same building with these high school students, some of which have really maintained their faith and belief, and they can see that, and they're seeing that, yep, the older kids are going to Eucharistic adoration, we're going, and they're at Mass together. I think that can be a real positive thing, because that is such a turbulent time for kids.
I would believe it. I think one of the, I've been pleased to hear in the last few years how this has become just a regular topic of conversation, but the concern about the formation of men and young men in our day in particular is something that was overdue to be talking about. And why is that? It's because people like challenges. People like seriousness. Everybody feels their lives called to be meaningful and substantial. And so if you're not going to give people solid food, they're going to go find it someplace else. And I think by having the example of older children practicing devotions in different ways, that says to the younger children, this is an adult thing to do. If you want to grow up, this is what you need to do. And I would say that to when I used to teach confirmation classes to my confirmation students, when they were asked to be altar servers, I say, this is I hate to use this kind of canting language, but this is an act of leadership by being up on the by working with the priest, by serving at Mass, you are you're setting a model for what adulthood, what maturity, and what leadership looks like, and that will have ripple effects that you can't be aware of.
That's such a valuable thing for them to hear, because so often those things are looked upon as childish. So I did that when I was in elementary school, and then when I shifted out of elementary school and I graduated and came up to middle school or high school, I stopped doing that. Even I know there are parishes throughout the country that say, oh, once they're done with high school, they don't altar serve anymore. Well, no, they should be, as you said. Now the leader is training the new ones coming up and being the MC at the high holy days of Triduum and things like that. Just to I wanted to circle back for a moment, the fourth grade story that you shared, and how history in your school was taught through the lens of Catholicism, and again, not focusing. I'm from Massachusetts, so the Pilgrims have a little place in my heart. But the fact that it was so focused on, again, the Jesuits coming and entering into the existing culture and civilization, but then saying, let's elevate you and draw you up to the fullness of the truth, because the Native Americans, they had some semblance of a deity and of some being greater than them. Well, okay, now here's the rest of the story. What I find so fascinating and so wonderful about that is, with our schools going towards the liberal, Catholic liberal education and looking at all of these subjects through the lens of Catholicism and history, there's so much that in connecting it with your other stories, especially going forward then to your moment about, let me put this to the test, do I really believe? I think the answer is obvious, but I'll ask the question anyway. If you had not had that instruction in those formative years of the elementary grades, and you found yourself so many years later putting it to the test, would you have been as receptive to receiving what was given to you? Not just the Eucharist itself, but you said that other gift that came along with that.
Well, I probably wouldn't have thought to.
Right. So it
to
formed...
present myself for communion,
Right,
right? So
right.
first of all,
It formed you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just mention a couple other things. So my grandpa, Woodrow Wilson, who was born the year Wilson was reelected, I presume that's why. Not because he's related to the president, though there's some family lore that claims that, but that's all false. But anyhow, he was a very devout man and went on retreat routinely. He was lived most of his life in rural Illinois and Indiana, and then later Ohio. And one of the photographs that I would look at as a little boy was of my grandpa at retreat at Notre Dame with other men outside the Golden Dome. And knelt down next to him in the picture is my dad, who's a boy. And that picture always meant a great deal to me, because it told me that what was serious, what was responsible, what mattered was what my grandpa was doing and what my dad was doing with him. And so there were, the example of my parents was very helpful. Those things all shaped me in different ways, and I'm sure played a role, though it's hard to look God's grace in the mouth and say what would or wouldn't have happened, because it was such an overwhelming moment of certainty in that church.
But you bring up another good point, is it was not solely just the education through the Catholic lens, but it was the example of your family.
Yes.
And I'm sure it was the example then of the community of your family's friends as well.
Yes.
And that's at the ending of the article that you shared with us, Lucian, you hinted about that we're not meant to be in isolation. The faith is meant to be lived in community.
Yes.
And even, especially now, and I think with some of the students that I remember teaching throughout my 23 years of education, there were those students that you could pinpoint and say, God is working in that child. God is working in that student. They are moved to do things spiritually, prayerfully, sacramentally, that their peers are not. And yet they were so timid and shy about it, because I'm sure they felt in isolation. Because even within the Catholic schools in which I taught, it was not this fully encompassed of the Catholicism is permeating our culture of, yes, our school, but not our home lives. And so that bridge needs to be that gap needs to be bridged. It's so important.
I mean, somehow, it would be great if we could make Catholicism cool.
Yes.
Hipster.
It is. It is.
It is. I know. Actually, it's this is the greatest way to rebel against your parents. Become fully Catholic.
Right.
Well, I was just at a radio show called Based Catholic, and that's actually their introduction.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
So
Wow.
so that's there's some truth there.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that it would be like in the broader culture, it'd be edgy. So.
Well, there's some. We were talking a little bit about feast days and festivals, and you mentioned that in your article that we've lost so much of that. And I have to say, one of the highlights of my adult life is this was probably 10 years ago. Myself and my family, my wife and a couple of my kids and one of my sisters, we went back to Sicily. And it just happened that we were there on the feast day. It was a town called Alcamo, which is not too far from Palermo. And it happened to be the feast day for that city. And that feast day was by far, I think it was a 3-day celebration. When they had the parade through the town, the procession, they had everybody in the town, including the mayor, the Boy Scouts, everyone. You were either in the parade or you were standing on the side cheering for all the people in the parade. And that was the point at which I said to myself, even though for many of those people, I don't want to suggest that they're all like devout Catholics, but there was something so much where their faith was a part of their life and their culture. I just was a part of that for just that one day. I said, we have nothing like this back in Michigan, where you kind of experience. I mean, the mayor was in the parade. It was not just this Catholic thing, and so actually partly because of that, when we came back to Grand Rapids and kind of shortly after that, when my daughter was in high school, we started a St. Joseph's table and an altar as a part of St. Joseph's Day, and now we're doing that at St. Thomas. And I just met with the families, and we're talking about what we're going to do this March. And now there's all this excitement about, we've got to make the faith more than just coming to church on Sunday. You've got to find ways to make it a part of life and to make it a rich part of life. So because I can say in Sicily, those kids, because they have a fair with rides, they got the whole thing going on. They look forward to that every year because they know there's going to be all this cool stuff happening. And so I think though we can't ever, I don't want to suggest, we can do it the way they do it in Sicily, but I think parts of that we can do, that kind of bringing back those feast days.
Let me mention two things on that, actually. So the first one is what does it even mean to speak the word culture? The word culture, by definition, means the whole way of life of a people. And what you're describing is that when we talk about Catholic culture most often, we're talking about the sort of incidental stuff to the side, like bingo night for the old ladies, and or just about, having some sort of physical ritual, like blessing yourself as you walk past a church, but and separating it out from the core faith propositions and beliefs of the church. So, I won't name it, but a certain basketball coach once said that he was a cultural Catholic. I mean, he had the background in it, but he didn't actually believe, okay? But actually, that's not a good way to use that word. We should reclaim the word and its original definition, and that is this, that culture is the further elaboration of cult. And this is something that goes back to the Old Covenant. And Pope Benedict speaks about this in The Spirit of the Liturgy. That in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, he says that the Israelites knew that they had to go into the desert and go to the Promised Land. And it wasn't just because the Promised Land was a good earth, although it may have been that. It was the Promised Land because it would be the place where they could establish right worship. And out of worship emerges the law and ethics. That is to say, the whole form of your life. And so what I think we need to recover is not just the centrality of the Mass and of the Eucharist, as important as that is, but understanding that out of these things irradiates or flows like water out of a spring everything else. And so we need to rebuild the culture that flows out of our liturgical life. What we have done is, for many of us, we've held on to the liturgical life, but lost its connection with the broader flow of our lives, I guess you would say. And that, so I'll leave it with that one, actually.
So Lucian, talking about the festival in near Palermo, so that kind of Catholic culture where that was all embracing. My guess is that was moved in the late 1800s into America in the neighborhoods in Brooklyn, in Chicago, etc. And yet there's this really kind of strange tension between Catholicism and America. I mean, in the sense that at first they were immigrants. It's not until like 1960 you get a book by, I think it was at Drew University at the time. Will Herberg wrote "Catholic Protestant Jew." That was a big deal. It was like that was at the first time in American consciousness, in like the mainstream American consciousness, that Jews and Catholics and Protestants could be thought of as like of the same ilk, the same table, And we're talking about even Kennedy's presidencies in the 60s, right? And it's like, wait a second, this guy's Catholic. That was a big deal, So and then just to think about like, now is there any place in the world besides, I don't know, maybe Poland and a few places where you do get that whole, what you were talking about, James, the whole world view kind of really. I mean, think about like, I need to go back to the Middle Ages, to really find that robust Catholicism, because modernity is working against it every place now. Religion in general, but particularly against that sense of this is all encompassing. No, you do your thing, I'll do my thing, and that you can do that over in the ghetto kind of.
Very simple request, but could you restate your definition of culture?
Culture is the whole way of life of a people.
The whole way of life of a people.
Yes, and Pope Benedict talks about this efflorescence of culture out of cult in his book, The Spirit of Liturgy. The most famous instance of talking about this relationship is a wonderful book by another German, but a philosopher, not a theologian, Joseph Pieper, in his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. It says that the origin of culture is in cult, and for Pieper, this makes a crucial, what would we say, qualification in the possibility for human beings to be joyful or to be at leisure. What do I mean by that? Because culture, which includes the stuff of leisure, festival, any kind of taking of joy in the good things of the world, because it emerges out of cult, it's not possible for human beings on their own to establish holidays, holy days. There's no such thing as a flourishing secular festival or holiday. Every holiday really is a holy day. That is to say, it has to be given by God in some way. We see that, look at how even the most secularized person celebrates Christmas. It wouldn't be possible to celebrate it that way if there weren't a sense, even for the person who thinks of himself as an unbeliever, of a sense of the transcendent bowing down by with its grace to enter the world and say, this will be a day that you celebrate. The French revolutionaries famously established a whole calendar with feast days for all the great philosophers. Voltaire would have his feast day, etc. And none of that worked. And it was probably because it was boring. Nobody wanted to celebrate Voltaire and take a day off work. They wanted we want to celebrate the real thing, and we can only have the real thing if we know that the meaning we claim things have comes not from our will, but from another, and that other will always be the divine. It will be God.
Boy, there's so much there we could talk about. But you just talked about leisure and kind of culture, and I think one of the places, and I want us to chat a little bit about culture in the schools and how we can help support a more authentic and rich Catholic culture, and also culture in the families. And one of the things I deeply believe, and I just wanted to chat with you about it, is one place to start is Sundays. Is unfortunately, especially in modern society, we have become so fixated on sports. And I gotta say, I'm a huge Lion fan, so I like watching. But we have really kind of replaced what used to be the place of faith and family and religion with either sports or other activities, like whatever classes the kids may be, the dance class or the soccer club or whatever. And I think one place we can really start to, if we could start to reclaim Sundays, I think that's one place where we could really start to make some inroads. Because as much as we talk about, kind of reclaiming kind of Catholic culture, I think it does have to be fairly winsome in the sense that people need to experience not just, if I'm a disciple, I need to be willing to do hard things. I need to be willing to fast before communion and go to Mass on Sundays. But the positive, which is I need to just set aside some time to just devote to family and friends and God. And kind of, I just love to get your thoughts on kind of Sundays as a part of reclaiming culture in our families.
I just wrote an endorsement for a book last week, and the title of the book is Reclaiming the Lord's Day. And so, I would agree with what you said there. It tells you what kind of desperate times we're living in, that just to reclaim an hour or so on Sunday is the battle we have to fight. But I think it is a battle we have to fight. I wanted to reflect on one thing kind of related to that, and that's a lot of us have heard Pope Benedict preach multiple times, but going back to the 1960s, about the idea about the church as smaller but stronger, as a creative minority. And there's a lot of truth to that. One of the great blessings of the last few years has been to see, for instance, how much stronger Catholic schools in general are in terms of their catechesis and their understanding of the faith and their efforts to evangelize students than 10, 15, 20 years ago. That's the sign of a church, in some sense, contracting, but also becoming more dense, in the good sense of becoming thicker with doing the good things that a Catholic school and the Catholic Church ought to be doing. But there's another side in which being a creative minority isn't great, and that is that Catholicism is a culture in the most profound sense. It's the whole way of life of the people of God. And so anywhere it's in retreat, anywhere that it's not informing one's life, is a sign that something has gone wrong and that revival needs to be contemplated. And repentance too, very often. Maybe it's just because I have 2 degrees from Notre Dame. I never felt obliged to choose between God and sports. They won.
They
were compatible. Still remember one of my first years at Notre Dame. Notre Dame lost to Boston College, which was dreadful enough. But it was so after having won the first 8 games of the season. And as soon as the game ended, I ran immediately to the Basilica for Mass because there was no place else on earth I could be at that moment in my grief.
Well, that's great. Oh, so James, there's a poem that would you be willing to read? And I'd love to have you do that, and we can comment on it and talk about it.
Yeah, sure. So I wrote a long poem for speaking of Benedict XVI, for the Benedict XVI Institute in the Archdiocese of San Francisco, called The River of the Immaculate Conception. And it's actually a long poem that retells the story of Catholicism in America. And in the 5th part of it, called Gloriosa Dicta Sanctitae, which is a line in Latin from a Mass that I was commissioned to write about as part of this poem, I get to talk a little bit about those French Jesuit missionaries, and even a little bit about my education at St. Thomas Aquinas. So I thought this might be a very good Michigan Catholic poem to share with everybody. And it has a little nod towards your pilgrims.
Excellent.
When we think of our land, we often think of those bare wilds waiting to be claimed, as if it were a force of will alone that made it ours, and mixing sweat with dust, its matter with our labor, what was nothing becomes somehow a thing that might be loved, be built upon, and put to use, defended. I have been one of those who stand in awe of pioneers and makers of great things, of those who slice a sharp spade through thick roots. How much less often do we think of land not as the stuff lain idle to be grabbed, but as a stage, a platform where we stand, not empty, for upon it we depend, not arbitrary, for it's all been formed so long before our dawning that we sense 100 histories have gone to dust, deepening the hillsides, carving out its rivers. How rarely do we think of it as place, as scene where destinies are shaped by grace. So in my childhood, the lakeside chapel, modest and plain, shaped like a wooden boat, where I heard Mass in summertime, was named for St. Deporres, and he prayed for us, though all I knew about him was his name. And so in Maryland and San Francisco, the place is named not for what we have done there, but for what we hope we might still receive. The walls of city, home, and church designed just to contain what grace will fill them with. So, sitting in my classroom as a boy, the school named for St. Thomas of Aquino, I heard my teacher speak of Michigan, of Joliet, Dablon, and Père Marquette. And telling us their stories, she unfolded another history than the one we're used to. One in which, by the Holy Spirit's grace, men slipped along the wilderness's veins, bearing such names as hitherto unspoken might be to consecrate a land of saints. For naming is a kind of grace, not deed. It clarifies what was not understood, such that what outwardly remains the same becomes itself more fully and more truly transformed by the articulate light. To lay above a saint's bones on the shore, to pray the words that saints have prayed before, to name and know what comes forth from the darkness. These are the occupations of a place, its purpose and its glory and its grace.
Wow, that's beautiful.
That is. Wendell Berry would love that.
Yes, yes.
Well, and you know, James, as you talk about Michigan and we actually mentioned this with Father Kassar, Father Michael, in our last podcast. And did I share about the two the Jesuit missionaries that when I was in college at U of M, I read two books. One was called Saint Among the Hurons, and one was called Saint Among the Savages. One about Saint Isaac Jogues, and one about Jean de Brebeuf. And these men were such. You talked about doing hard things. The life that they lived and the hardship they endured because of their love for God and to preach the gospel and to convert, the new land. It was so moving. I mean, I had never read anything like that. I could not imagine people being that willing to just suffer and die for their faith.
Yes.
And it really kind of changed my life. And we have such a rich history here in Michigan because they were really they've still got their. I actually have never been there, but they've got they've done a recreation of their camp up on the shores of Lake Huron. I forget the name of it, but in any event, I want to go there this summer because I think we need to tell those stories to our young people.
Yes.
They need to understand that this is your heritage. You wouldn't have a faith were it not for these incredibly heroic Jesuits who came over here and spilled their blood and gave their lives so that you could be going to the school today and that there'd be this legacy that you see today.
Yeah, I actually published 2 years ago a poem called In Memory of the North American Martyrs. A
Oh,
poem that was
really?
also commissioned by the Benedict XVI Institute, and it retells the stories of Jogues and Brebeuf. Those books you mentioned are phenomenal books, and there are children's novels also of a children's novel of St. Isaac Jogues that Ignatius publishes that I read with my kids. That was really wonderful. It softens some of the more brutal aspects of the tale just a little bit. But one thing that people may or may not know, but that's wonderful to think of, is this wonderful Christmas carol that we often hear sung, the Huron Carol, which was written by Father Brebeuf. It was probably the first composition of Western music in a Native American language. And it's a beautiful carol.
It is beautiful.
And so, he, in some ways, Brebeuf's mission work was in several ways disaster. It was a disaster in that it wasn't clear if he was able to preach successfully to any of the Indians, although long term, I think most certainly he was successful. It was disastrous in the sense that he was brutally killed in Ontario, not that far from here. But that hymn is something that is all but universally known and appreciated, and it continues to speak of the the incarnation, the Feast of the Nativity of Christmas, with all the furniture or the clothing, as it were, of the Huron peoples, and it's just a beautiful testimony to how to evangelize the world.
So this is going to be a removable aside. So you can you can edit this out because it made it. But from the beginning of talking about the Puritans and the Catholics, I was recalling this book that I read in grad school. It was part of my comps. It's American Indians and Christian Missions by Henry Warner Bowden, and basically it compares missionary work of Puritans. In a nutshell, Puritans wanted to make the Iroquois into little Puritans, so they would teach them English and dress them up in black suits. Okay, that's how you become a Christian. The French, the Jesuits coming down for the Hurons, they learned the language, and they would the French trappers would intermarry actually, and so it was this sense of how do we? I mean, talking about culture, right? How do we not just appropriate or like have this culture appropriate ours, but how do we come in and infuse that culture with what is naturally theirs? I remember that it's like the Huron warrior used to, if they would kill someone, they would take their heart out and eat it. And so when they got to John chapter 6, this is you eat my flesh and drink my blood. They had to, when they were translating the Bible into Huron, they had to kind of like step lightly around that passage. But they actually, it's really interesting. If you think maybe we could possibly we're talking about modernity right here, and we're talking about reclaiming the Sabbath. How do we as Catholics actually know the modern sentiment and desires and failings and wants and stuff better than they know, and actually show them how that's really Catholic. They don't know that they're Catholics with. I mean, they because they're human beings. They're Catholics, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this in a particular way just this morning. When you present the possibility of religious faith to someone in our day, the person's likely to think that the only alternative, is just materialism.
Right.
There's materialism or there's Christianity, and there's nothing else on offer. But for the first 500 years of the Catholic Church, that was not the case. In fact, every educated person could be reasonably sure that he was in some sense a theist, and that the world was intelligibly ordered according to some kind of divine plan. That's what the word cosmos suggests in Greek philosophy. It's what providence suggests in Christianity. And it wasn't because earlier ages were somehow more superstitious. It's rather the general theism was a product of philosophical reflection, that we can know, and our Catholic faith actually commands us to affirm that we can know by reason alone the existence of God and the order of his providence. And it's important for us to recover a vision of what that looks like. Because people may think that they're materialists, but they're not. They've got their gods.
Yeah.
And we need to, rather than try to convince people to go from 0 to 1, to recognize rather, as the first Christians did to the pagans, either that these many gods are in fact one God, or in fact this is a true account of what Christians actually had to say to most of the ancient peoples of the Roman world. You all have already concluded that there must be one God, that there's one principle that is a divine principle of reality. Jesus Christ reveals that principle. And so we have some news for you. You can know this one God much more intimately than you ever thought. And, the most famous episode of this is in Acts 18, where Paul's in the Areopagus, and he points to the altar of the unknown God and says, "I've got a name for you at last." That moment in Scripture has always been it's just so central to my understanding of what we need to be, who we need to be as Catholics in the world who take the evangelical mission of the church seriously. That we've got to recognize that there are fundamentals and rudiments of the faith that are already scattered across the world, and they just need to be awakened to their true nature. First of all, that feels like a less daunting class than going from nothing. But second of all, I think it's actually just a more frank and honest account of what our culture is. And so some people will talk about contemporary culture, modernity, as being a pagan culture, and in some ways that's kind of true. It's. But then other people have said, if only they were pagans, then they could believe in something. So I think maybe there's a little truth in both of those propositions, and it's a daunting task to see what we all face in trying to maintain, and not just maintain, but to build up a renewed culture in our day. But it's not as hopeless as it might be, precisely because there are those scattered seeds of reason and intellect in all aspects of reality that really do lead to the Catholic Church inevitably, if you can just, as it were, point out the breadcrumbs for everybody.
Well, you made me think of, I was reading an article not too long ago by Fran Mayer, who writes a lot in First Things, and he talked about one of my favorite books, and I think, Dr. Mojo, I share this love with you, he said every year in January he rereads The Lord of the Rings because it gives him hope that this is all of this is beyond our control. We just have to trust God. Yes. And I thought, you know what? I haven't read The Lord of the Rings in probably 15 years, and I've just started reading it again. And kind of now reading it through this lens of, I'm really reading this to see how God is working kind of behind the scenes. The book is even richer than I've always appreciated, because I'm kind of reading it looking for certain signs that I wasn't before. And it just gives me great hope that, as dark as it may seem sometimes in the culture around us, God is there, and He's working in amazing ways.
Well, and the Holy Spirit is working too, because just as I sit and I listen to all of this, and Mojo, your question is like, how do we then sort of permeate the culture of today, much like the missionaries permeated the culture and brought them up to the higher level? It seems very superficial, but I think it's an excellent example. You had the Michigan won the Nationals, correct?
Yeah.
The football, right? Yeah. And what do you have a quarterback who says, is quoted saying, I am more than football. I am put here for more than football. God has something in store for me. And so you have a culture that, not just here in Jackson, but in high schools everywhere throughout the country, where they are looking for something greater than themselves. And they are finding it in something that is very good in athletic achievement. But then you have someone who seems to be completely out of the realm of any religion or any kind of culture, Christian or Catholic, who then comes forward and says, I am made for more than this. And so there we go. Here's a little inlet. Let's talk about that now. What is it about this person what is it that is in his background? What is it in his upbringing that led him to this statement of, I am made for more than this, when you think this is the ultimate, man, you have achieved everything. And it goes back to what you were talking about, how every man-made holiday falls flat because it doesn't come from our Creator. I never knew there was a holiday for Voltaire.
Well, it didn't last.
Clearly. Yeah. But so these things we are good because God made us good, and we are searching for Him. And so everything that we see in our culture as disoriented, it just needs to be oriented towards God, but we are encountering people who are struggling to do that, and they don't know how to do it. So we need to be the example. We need to find those examples and say, okay, let's put this up in front so everyone can see it. But also, just even in my own work, you said there's these seeds, these pockets. I go back to Benedict XVI talking about a very small church, but very, very faithful, and it will be very fruitful. And so if you can say, okay, I have a family here, I have a family here, I have a family here, let's bond those families together, and then the ripple effect will make it grow, and it will eventually change the culture. I mean, you're going to have, I mean, the devil is hard at work and appears to be winning, but we know the end of the story. He's not going to. But it's just, as I sit and listen and I hear everything, the Holy Spirit is working. The Holy Spirit is working, and it's strong. There is hope.
I remember when I was first volunteering in youth ministry, actually in Boston, 20-some years ago. I don't know if somebody told me this or if this is just the conclusion I drew. I think I was probably told. I made a practice of not looking for any sign that what I was doing made any difference to the kids. Just trusting that I'm not going to see these seeds bear fruit, but I just have to trust that they will. And that's, I mean, that is the life of faith. I mentioned the Lord of the Rings. Just brings up the readings. The first reading last Sunday at Mass was the Lord calling Samuel, as was living in the temple, and the first book of Samuel I've always found so compelling for many reasons, but one of them is that in the passages just before that episode. Well, let me go back to the episode. It's the Lord calling Samuel. Samuel goes to Eli. Here I am. And Eli eventually says, next time you hear my voice, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And an aside in that passage says, the Lord had not spoken to Samuel before. But just earlier in the book, it says, the word of the Lord was not often heard in those days. Yeah. That's to say, Eli, the whole of Israel is a place that is desolate and in decline. God seems to have withdrawn himself. People are unfaithful. Even Eli the priest is not a very good priest. In fact, one of the best parts, from a storytelling point of view anyhow, in that moment, is that what God tells Samuel, when Samuel finally says, speak, Lord, your servant is listening, he says, go tell Eli that he and his sons are going to die. So, because they're bad priests. Okay. But what comes from this? So the world is in decline in that passage, just as at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, the goblins and the trolls are coming down from the mountains. Roads that were once great, as it were, Roman highways are now impassable because of the possibility of being murdered by strange forces in the darkness. Similarly, in Star Wars, in the awful movie The Phantom Menace, at the beginning of that film, we learned in that film that Yoda and the other Jedi are keeping it secret that they no longer have mastery of the Force as they once had. And it's out of these hours of darkness that Samuel comes into the world and becomes a prophet of God. And from Samuel comes David. And from David, eventually Christ. So is it in The Lord of the Rings that in these dark hours, 2 hobbits have to become heroes. So it's not I'm not encouraging everybody to just...
And Gollum might have his purpose.
Yes, and Gollum. So I'm not encouraging everybody to walk off to Mordor, but know that you probably will be called to walk off to Mordor.
Yes.
Well, I think that this has been great, and I think that's a wonderful way to end, is that we know God is working and we all have our place. And so we just have to pray and find what our place is in helping to rebuild the culture that God clearly wants to rebuild. Well, thanks to all of you for being here today. You've been listening to the Eucharistic Revival podcast at Good Shepherd Catholic Radio. Thanks for listening.